First of all, quickly, what was the catalyst? What made you decide to write about this? Something must have piqued your interest, and you said, you know what, I've got one or two or three things here. What was it that made you write?
Well, it was a picture of the city hall building where the police headquarters were on the third floor. I'd never really paid much attention to Ruby shooting Oswald before. I heard there were problems with the ramp and heard this and heard that, but I never looked into it because my focus was always on Oswald. But a few months ago, I looked at this building, which is the address 106 South Harvard. It's the first photograph in my work on the website. And I looked at that building. And my first thought was, who would think they could get into that building? It has 3 visible entrances and, of course, the 2 ramps. But who would think they could get into that building and get even near Oswald, let alone shoot Oswald? I mean, if if somebody wanted to shoot Oswald, there's police guarding every one of these entrances. How could you be sure that you get down the ramp without being stopped? And that's kind of what got me intrigued. And my first thought after looking at this building was, wow, I wouldn't even consider going through the entry or the side entries to this building. There must be another way. And then there's an adjoined building behind the City Hall building. It's a tan-colored building. And I looked at that building and I thought, I'd probably look at that building and see if there's any way that I could get into that building and then somehow get down to the ramp where Oswald was going to appear. And that's what I thought. That's what got me interested in it. Because one look at this City Hall building, there's just no way that you could believe that you could walk down that ramp or walk anywhere in that building without being stopped by police, because the police were everywhere. So that's what got me initially interested in it. It didn't make sense that Ruby just happened to be there within, a few minutes of when he shot Oswald. I mean, there's no way that any person would look at that building and think, oh, I'm just going to walk down the ramp. Police guards everywhere. I mean, it just didn't make any sense. So that's what got me interested in it. It's
Good.
like,
And then, what happened?
Another way.
Yeah. And then the Warren Commission said, some researchers interviewed people and they say, well, no, there was nobody here. There's nobody there. I forget the guy's name. Regardless, you know the names. They said, no, he was never. And then the Warren Commission says, well, somebody had to let him in, or if they didn't let him in, he just walked down the ramp. And then, of course, other people say, nobody walked down the ramp. Let's start the article.
Okay. With Harvey Oswald's so-called defection to Russia, his staged Fair Play for Cuba Committee activities, and his communist-loving history going all the way back to the Marine Corps, it was easy for the conspirators to paint the Russian-speaking Oswald as a communist with ties to Castro, which is exactly what happened. But Oswald's ties to the FBI, the CIA, and likely to military intelligence made the high-level people behind the assassination of President Kennedy enter into a full-scale cover-up. Now, Harvey Oswald, the chosen patsy, the Russian-speaking Oswald, had for years demonstrated his willingness to follow difficult orders, and following orders was critical in the days and hours before and after the assassination. Oswald, following orders, had to be in the right place at the right time for his designated role as the patsy, unknown to him, to succeed. After President Kennedy was assassinated, the conspirators, however, knew that the patsy had to be eliminated. And the reason for that was very simple. They knew Oswald would be arrested, and they knew that it would be only a matter of time before he realized that he had been set up to take the blame for the assassination of President Kennedy. In other words, on one hand, he's the perfect patsy. On the other hand, what if he starts to talk? What if he starts to talk about his defection to Russia, his connections with CIA, FBI? So, in my view, it was a double-edged sword. You've got the right person, but if he starts to, open his mouth when he's arrested, that's the end of everything for these conspirators. So Oswald, facing murder charges, would probably explain his early life, where and how he learned to read, write, and speak Russian, as well as his connections and the names of contacts within the CIA and FBI. With this information, the search for the real plotters would have been relentless. When the conspirators developed their plan to assassinate President Kennedy and blame Oswald as the patsy, they knew their plan had to include the elimination of Oswald as soon as possible after the assassination of President Kennedy. And that's the subject of this essay. Now, my interest in Kennedy, JFK, has always focused on Oswald, and to a much lesser degree on Jack Ruby. Recently, I looked briefly at a photograph, like I said before, of the old Dallas City Hall at 106 South Harwood in Dallas, which was built in 1914. On Sunday morning, November 24th, Oswald was to be transferred from police headquarters, that's on the third floor of the City Hall building, to the county jail. There were dozens of police officers in and around this building providing security for Oswald's transfer. The Warren Commission said Ruby had entered the parking area below the City Hall building by walking down the Main Street ramp. But if Ruby's intention was to enter the building and kill Oswald, then there was no way that Ruby could be sure that he would be able to avoid dozens of police officers and enter the building by walking down the ramp. As I looked at the photo of the old City Hall, my thought was it would have been nearly impossible for Ruby to have avoided the police and enter the building by walking down the ramp. The main entrance to City Hall, which was guarded by police officers, was on Harwood Street, and there were two smaller entrances on Main and Commerce Street. The only other entrance, guarded by police officers, was the ramp to the underground parking, which provided access to the city jail, and this was in the basement. And the ramp goes from Main Street to Commerce Street. Now, I could not imagine how Ruby was able to enter the basement of City Hall without being seen and stopped by police officers. In this essay, we will share our work and thoughts with you as to when, where, and how Jack Ruby was able to gain entry into the basement of City Hall and murder Oswald. We will begin by taking a close look at the City Hall building, its history, its architecture, and in particular, points of entry into this building. The City Hall building, pictured above, was built in 1914 and was originally known as the Municipal Building. As can be seen from the architectural drawing below, there were 5 levels and 2 basement levels. The basement levels extended past, now this is difficult for people to understand. The basement levels actually extended past the exterior walls of the City Hall building to both Commerce and Main Street. Now, what that means is the basement levels were actually to the streets. You got cement sidewalks on Commerce Street and Main Street. And these sidewalks actually cover, or the roof, so to speak, the roof of the area, the basement area below. An underground ramp was built on the east side of the building in 1914 and ran from Commerce Street downward to a double-door entry on basement level 1. The Dallas Police Department is located on the 3rd floor of City Hall with a small jail on the 5th floor. In the sub-basement, known as basement level 2, the police department had a shooting range. In 1956, a new building was constructed on the east side of City Hall between Main and Commerce Street. These buildings were joined, which means that the east side of the City Hall building, with all the windows and all the architecture, all the cement stonework, was covered up by the new building. The ramp was also extended north from the double-door entry to Main Street. And when I say double-door entry, that is right by the jail office where Oswald was shot. So in 1956, that ramp was extended from that area up to Main Street. Now, the new annex building was joined, attached, if you will, to the older City Hall building. And it was built over the underground ramp that ran from Commerce to Main. Now, what people don't understand is that the ramp was actually not in the City Hall building. It was in the new building, directly under the annex building. Now, the Warren Commission made a drawing, Commission Exhibit 2179, and it shows the area where Oswald was shot. For many years, researchers have looked at this image and never realized that this drawing was of two different buildings. The police office, jail elevator, and the small hallway were in the basement of City Hall, which is shown on the left side of Commission Exhibit 2179. The police parking area and the ramp were in the basement of the newly constructed annex building, shown on the right side of the ramp. The image given to us by the Warren Commission, Commission Exhibit 2179, shows the two buildings joined together. The City Hall building, built in 1914, and the annex building, 1956. And the underground ramp is between the two buildings. Now, this drawing given to us by the Warren Commission, the site of the Oswald shooting, was never properly identified by the Warren Commission because, like I said, this image is actually of two separate buildings. To make matters even more confusing, both of these buildings were known for years as the Municipal Building. Numerous FBI, Dallas Police, Warren Commission documents, witnesses, etc., often refer to the, quote, Municipal Building without identifying which building they're talking about. The inscription, Municipal Building, was, in fact, placed above the entry door of each building, as can be seen in the photographs below. So each building was called the Municipal Building, although one was called the Annex Building and the other was called City Hall. They were each identified in writing above the entry door, big, identification, Municipal Building. And this has caused much confusion among researchers when reading the documents, police reports, and so on, because a reference to the Municipal Building without any further description could be either building. Now, the original building, Municipal Building, built in 1914, was also known as City Hall and office as Dallas Police Headquarters. In this essay, I will refer to the building on Harwood Street, built in 1914, as City Hall. The newer building, constructed in 1956, had entries on both Commerce Street and Main Street, and was originally known as the Municipal Annex Building. I will refer to this building as the Annex Building. Now, in my website, I have done an overhead view, like if you had a drone, I think it's actually a satellite, of these buildings. I'll try and explain to you. On the very left of the image, the photograph, is Harwood Street. The City Hall building, which I've identified by blue and outlined in blue, that's the first building. Adjoining that building is the Annex Building, which I've outlined in red. That's to the east, directly to the east of City Hall. Now, directly east of the Annex Building is a parking lot, and directly east of the parking lot is Western Union. Now, those four places that I've identified cover an entire city block. Harwood on one side, Pearl Expressway on the other side. And they're all 1, 2, 3, 4. Now, across the street from City Hall was the All Right parking lot, where Jack Ruby parked his 1960 Oldsmobile on the morning of November 24th. The Western Union office is about 300 feet east of the Main Street ramp. Around 11 o'clock on November 24th, Jack Ruby parked his car at All Right Parking, walked across Main Street to the Western Union office, and wired $25 to one of his dancers, Karen Carlin, who lived in Fort Worth. Ruby then left Western Union, walked 300 feet, and somehow got into the police parking area in basement level 1 of City Hall. As Ruby left Western Union and began walking toward City Hall, Oswald was escorted from Captain Pritz's office on the 3rd floor of City Hall to the basement. Ruby managed to get into the basement about 1 minute before Oswald arrived in the basement. The Warren Commission concluded that Ruby entered the basement of the police station from the Main Street ramp. Now, I've got a photograph on Main Street that shows everything we've been talking about. It shows the City Hall building, Annex building, parking lot, and Western Union building. All buildings right in a row. So you can have a visual understanding of what we're talking about. Now, the Warren Commission said, of course, that Ruby entered the basement from the Main Street ramp, which was guarded by Officer Roy Vaughn. Vaughn, however, swore he did not see Ruby enter the building. Police Inspector Jack Revelle interviewed Vaughn, and he said, quote, "I am satisfied that Roy Vaughn did not see Jack Ruby, nor did he knowingly permit him to enter the basement," end quote. Officer Napoleon Daniels agreed with Vaughn and said, "No, definitely not. There was nobody entering the ramp." The Warren Commission, however, concluded that Ruby did go down the ramp and that his arrival in the basement was a combination of luck and coincidence. But the fact that Oswald's transfer was delayed well beyond an hour after the announced time of 10 o'clock makes Ruby's arrival on cue for shooting Oswald much more than coincidence and absurdly improbable. Ruby's whereabouts and his activities after President Kennedy was shot and killed will provide the answer as to whether Oswald's murder was planned and premeditated or just spontaneous, as the Warren Commission has told us. We will also try to show how Ruby was able to avoid dozens of Dallas police and enter the basement of City Hall 1 to 2 minutes before Oswald arrived. Ironically, it was Jack Ruby who pointed us in the right direction the day he shot Oswald. Ruby said, quote, "Who else could have timed it so perfectly by seconds? If it were timed that way, then someone in the police department is guilty of giving the information as to when Oswald was coming down," end quote. Let's go back to November 22nd. Within hours of President Kennedy's assassination, Jack Ruby closed his Carousel Club and began spending a lot of time at City Hall. Defense attorney Travis Kirk worked in the Dallas District Attorney's office for 6 years. When interviewed by the FBI, Kirk said that Ruby and Fritz, Captain Fritz, were close friends, and that Ruby was allowed complete run of the police station, and particularly the Homicide and Inspectors Bureau. Kirk said that Fritz was a dominating, dictatorial officer with a photographic memory. Robert Lee Sharman, who worked on and off as a musician at the Carousel Club, said that an older detective by the name of Fritz frequented the Carousel Club. Detectives Everhart and Cody were close friends of Ruby. Lieutenant James Gilmore was a frequent visitor to the Carousel Club and was very friendly with Ruby. Two of Ruby's friends, Alfred Davidson and longtime friend Regan Thurman, said Ruby was casually acquainted with the chief of police and other high-level police officers. Lieutenant George Arnett was also a very close friend of Ruby. Theodore Fleming, a Dallas police officer for 8 years, told the FBI, quote, "Good likelihood that any officer acquainted with Ruby would have allowed him in the building if Ruby had requested permission to do so." John William Fritz, Will Fritz, was captain of homicide and robbery and had a reputation as a skilled interrogator and a reputation for being able to remember minute details of investigations that occurred years earlier. His bureau was considered the elite unit of the Dallas Police Department. District Attorney Henry Wade told the Warren Commission that Fritz, quote, "runs a kind of one-man operation," end quote, and was reluctant to tell others what he was doing. Warren Commission Joseph Ball asked Fritz if he or other officers questioned Oswald during interrogation. Fritz answered, quote, "I don't think those officers talked to him very much while I was out of the office. I think they might have asked him a few questions, but didn't ask him much," end quote. Captain Fritz was clearly running a one-man operation. He was in control of the interrogations, and he decided which questions would be asked and which questions would not be asked of a suspect. Fritz decided when to take notes. He was always in control of his handwritten notes, and clearly in control of what information he gave to the press. Because of his experience and his intimidating demeanor, most Dallas police officers respected and feared Fritz more than they feared Dallas Chief Jesse Curry. On the early afternoon of November 22nd, Dallas police were investigating the murder of Officer Tippit at 10th and Patton in Oak Cliff. Captain Westbrook, in charge of the personnel office at police headquarters, arrived at the scene at 10th and Patton around 1:37 or 1:38 p.m., driving his unmarked dark blue squad car. FBI agent Bob Barrett arrived at 1:42, parked his car, and walked toward Tippett's patrol car. Barrett explained, quote, "I went on over there, and Captain Westbrook was there with several of his officers. It hadn't been very long when Westbrook looked up and saw me and called me over. He had this wallet in his hand. Now, I don't know where he found it, but he had the wallet in his hand. The wallet was there. There's no getting around that. Westbrook asked me, 'Do you know who Lee Harvey Oswald is? And do you know who Alec Heidel is?' And I said, 'No, I never heard of him.'" End quote. Westbrook then showed Barrett the wallet and the contents of the wallet. Barrett said, quote, "I'm adamant there was a wallet," end quote. There's no doubt that Barrett saw the second wallet, an extremely important piece of evidence that would link Oswald to Heidel and to the weapons that killed both Tippit and Kennedy. As Westbrook showed the wallet to Barrett and to fellow police officers, WFAA TV Channel 8 news photographer Ron Ryland filmed the wallet. In the film clip, Sergeant Bud Owens is holding the wallet while Captain Doty was looking at the wallet. Identification cards in this wallet identified Lee Harvey Oswald and Alec James Heidel as the prime suspects in the murder of Officer Tippit. The identification cards, one for Alec, A-L-E-K, James Heidel, and one for Alex, A-L-E-X, James Heidel, with a photo of Harvey Oswald, would link Oswald to the name Heidel, the name of the person who allegedly ordered the rifle from Klein Sporting Goods that was found on the 6th floor of the book depository. A few minutes later, when the police dispatcher reported a suspicious person had entered the Texas Theater, Westbrook and numerous police officers hurried to the theater. Harvey Oswald was arrested in the Texas Theater, taken out the front, placed in Westbrook's unmarked dark blue police squad car, and driven to City Hall at 12:52 p.m. Minutes after Oswald was arrested, something very unusual happened. An unidentified person from the Dallas Police Department contacted Army Intelligence Lieutenant Colonel Robert E. Jones, the operations officer of the 112th Intelligence Group in San Antonio, Army Intelligence. This unidentified person from the Dallas Police Department told Lieutenant Colonel Jones that when Lee Harvey Oswald was arrested, now remember, Jones said it was between, I haven't gotten into that. Jones said it was between 1:30 and 2 o'clock. And Oswald was arrested at 1:52. The times are very important. When Oswald was arrested in Dallas, he was carrying a selective service card bearing the name Alec James Heidel. That's what this person told Lieutenant Colonel Jones. When Oswald was arrested at 152, he was carrying a selective service card bearing the name Alec James Heidel. Now that's from the wallet that Westbrook had at 10th and Patton. Jones then contacted the Department of Justice, the FBI, and reported the information given to him by the unidentified man in the Dallas Police Department. Later that afternoon, 4:25 p.m., the special agent in charge of the FBI office in San Antonio sent a memo to Hoover and to the special agent in charge of the FBI office in Dallas, describing the information he'd received from Lieutenant Colonel Jones. Only 4 hours after President Kennedy was assassinated, J. Edgar Hoover was advised that Oswald was using the name Alec James Heidel. 15 years later, on April 20th, 1978, Lieutenant Colonel Jones told the House Select Committee that he got the information about Alec James Heidel from someone inside the Dallas Police Department between 1:30 and 2 o'clock p.m. A selective service card with the name Alec James Heidel first appeared in the wallet that Captain Westbrook had and first showed at the Tippit murder scene around 1:40 p.m. Now, neither FBI agent Barrett nor any of the police officers at the Tippit murder scene were known to have seen or touched the contents of that wallet. Westbrook had the wallet. He knew there was a selective service card in the wallet with the name Alex James Heidel, which is what he asked Barrett about. Westbrook left the Tippit murder scene a few minutes later with the wallet in his hand. I'm convinced that Westbrook was the unidentified person who telephoned Army Intelligence Colonel Jones after Oswald was arrested at 1:52 p.m. Now, that's Westbrook and the 10th and Patton wallet, which I will call the second wallet. The first wallet was still in Harvey Oswald's pocket when he was arrested at the Texas Theater. While en route to police headquarters, Detective Paul Bentley removed Harvey Oswald's wallet from his pants pocket. I will call that wallet the arrest wallet. When Oswald was arrived at headquarters, right at 2 o'clock p.m., we know it was 2 o'clock because we have a photograph of Oswald being led into the interrogation room with a clock. The clock reads 2 o'clock. Bentley gave Oswald's wallet to Lieutenant Baker in homicide and robbery about 5 minutes after 2. Bentley then went to Captain Westbrook's office to prepare reports. Lieutenant Baker placed Harvey Oswald's wallet on the table in the interrogation room. As Harvey Oswald sat handcuffed in a chair, Dallas Police Officer C.T. Walker began inspecting the contents of Oswald's arrest wallet. Moments later, Detective Gus Rose and Richard Stovall appeared, and they too began inspecting the contents of Oswald's wallet. A total of 12 items were found in Oswald's arrest wallet and listed by the FBI. One of the items was listed as 3 photographs. Therefore, the total number of items found in Oswald's arrest wallet was 14 items. And I've got pictures of those 14 items on the website. Before Fritz began to question Oswald around 2:20, a police officer told Fritz that Oswald had a room on Beckley. Now, think about that a minute, people. Why would anybody in the Dallas Police Department have any reason to know about Lee Harvey Oswald, let alone knowing he had a room on Beckley Street? Somebody knew that. And somebody told Captain Fritz he had a room on Beckley before Fritz started interrogating Oswald. Now, Fritz told this to the Warren Commission. And Warren Commission Attorney Joseph Ball asked Fritz the name of the officer who gave Fritz the information about Beckley Street. And Fritz said he didn't remember the officer's name. Sorry, I don't believe that for a second. How could Captain Fritz possibly forget the name of a fellow police officer who told him that Oswald had a room on Beckley only minutes after Oswald was brought to police headquarters? Who was this officer? Why would any Dallas police officer have any reason to know or be in contact with Oswald before November 22nd? This officer not only knew that Oswald had a room on Beckley, this officer also had access to the Homicide and Robbery Bureau, which on November 22nd was guarded by police officers. This unidentified officer had access to Captain Fritz only minutes after Oswald arrived at police headquarters. It would appear the police officer who told Fritz that Oswald had a room on Beckley was a high-ranking officer who had access to virtually everywhere on the 3rd floor. Oswald was by far the most important suspect in the history of the Dallas Police Department. And yet Fritz did not ask his fellow officer how he knew Oswald and how he knew Oswald had a room on Beckley. Fritz telling the Warren Commission that he did not remember the name of this officer is, to me, withholding what we now know to be very important information. The police officer who told Fritz that Oswald had a room on Beckley was likely the same officer who drove police car 207 past Oswald's rooming house an hour earlier. Several years ago, after reading Fritz's testimony, I spent a lot of time and think that I identified the 2 officers who I believe drove by 1026 Beckley in car number 207. Those police officers were Captain Westbrook and Sergeant Croy. I believe it was Captain Westbrook who told Fritz that Oswald had a room on Beckley. But Fritz had a very good reason for not identifying Westbrook to the Warren Commission. I was now very suspicious of Captain Fritz. After Westbrook returned to police headquarters, he gave, or perhaps shared, the wallet from the Tippit murder scene, the second wallet, with Captain Fritz. I believe with the appearance of a second wallet from the Tippit murder scene, Fritz realized and understood that someone was framing Oswald for the Tippit murder. Otherwise, how do you explain two wallets? How do you explain a wallet with Oswald's identification and the identification for Alec James Heidel at the Tippit murder scene? Fritz took possession, and this is important. Fritz took possession of the two Alec James Heidel ID cards from the second wallet. They're pictured below on the website. But, and this is very important, the second wallet disappeared. That's very, very important. Both ID cards have the name Alex James Heidel, and one card, the Selective Service card, has a photo of Harvey Oswald. The next morning, Saturday morning, Fritz interrogated Oswald and asked him about these cards. Now, Officer Jerry Hill was one of the 5 police officers who took Oswald from the Texas Theater to police headquarters. After Oswald was turned over to homicide and robbery, Sergeant Hill went to Captain Westbrook's office and began preparing a report on Tippit's death. A few minutes later, when Westbrook returned to his office, he told Hill to change the homicide report to say that Oswald was the suspect in both the Tippit case and the murder of President Kennedy. Later that afternoon, around 5:00 p.m., Jerry Hill, a former news reporter, was interviewed by NBC TV. Hill said, quote, "The only way we found out what his name was to remove his billfold and check it ourselves. He wouldn't even tell us what his name was," end quote. A reporter asked Hill, quote, "What was the name on the billfold?" End quote. Hill replied, quote, "Lee H. Oswald, Oswald, end quote. Hill said nothing about the name Alec James Heidel because those ID cards were not in Oswald's arrest wallet. Hill then talked at length about Oswald's defection, his marriage to a Russian woman, and his life in the Soviet Union. When a reporter asked Hill how he knew so much about Oswald's activities in the Soviet Union within a couple of hours, Hill said, quote, "Westbrook told me," end quote. It's obvious that on the day President Kennedy and Officer Tippit were murdered, Captain Westbrook knew far too much about Harvey Oswald. And for Westbrook, head of the personnel department at Dallas Police Headquarters, to drive past Oswald's rooming house at 1:00 p.m., to be at the book depository, to be at the Tippit murder scene, to have a second Oswald wallet, to be at the Texas Theater when Oswald was arrested, is a pretty clear indication that he was involved as a conspirator. Around 7:30 p.m., with reporters, news people, and cameras filling the police station, Jack Ruby tried to enter Captain Fritz's office on the 3rd floor of City Hall where Oswald was being interrogated, but he was stopped by 2 uniformed officers. How did Ruby know that Oswald was in Fritz's office? Why did Ruby attempt to enter Fritz's office? At 10:30, Ruby stopped at Phil's Delicatessen to purchase sandwiches and make phone calls. One of the phone calls was overheard by Delicatessen employee John Frickstad. During the call, Ruby said, quote, "If anything should come up, I can be reached at KLIF radio station." In parentheses, that's owned by Gordon McClendon, who was a boyhood friend, a classmate, and close friend of senior CIA officer David Atlee Phillips. End quote. Ruby took the sandwiches and drove to Dallas City Hall. Later that evening, District Attorney Henry Wade was giving a late-night press conference, 11:15 p.m. Ruby was not only in the crowd of reporters, he was standing on a table with a clear view of Oswald. In fact, Tony Record said that Ruby insisted on standing on the table even though he didn't have a camera. When Wade said that Oswald was a member of the Free Cuba Committee, a group populated by CIA assets and supporters, such as Claire Booth Luce, Admiral Arleigh Burke, Hal Hendricks, Jack Ruby corrected him and said, quote, "That's fair play for Cuba Committee, Henry," end quote. How and why Jack Ruby knew about the Fair Play for Cuba Committee is unknown. I mean, why would Ruby have any idea about the Fair Play for Cuba Committee in New Orleans? Newsreel footage from WFAA-TV and NBC shows that during the press conference, Ruby was impersonating a news reporter, probably KLIF radio. Some speculate that Ruby may have hoped to kill Oswald that night. Ruby, in fact, told the FBI that he had his loaded, snub-nosed Colt Cobra .38 revolver in his right-hand pocket during the press conference. Saturday morning, November 23rd. By Saturday morning, Captain Westbrook and Captain Fritz were very familiar with the two Alec James Heidel ID cards from the second wallet. Now we must remember, Police Sergeant Bud Owens, who was at 10th and Patton and was filmed examining the second wallet, he was in the interrogation room when Fritz asked Oswald about these two cards. Fritz showed the Selective Service ID card with Oswald's photo to Harvey Oswald, but Oswald refused to answer any questions about the card. Secret Service Inspector Kelly wrote, quote, "Fritz showed Oswald a Selective Service card that was taken out of his wallet, which bore the name Alex Heidel. Oswald refused to discuss this after being asked for an explanation by both Fritz and by FBI agent James Bookout," end quote. Oswald refused to discuss these cards with Fritz because it is likely he'd never seen either one of the cards and realized he was being framed. Both of these cards came from the second wallet that first appeared at the Tippit murder scene in the hands of Captain Westbrook. The Selective Service card with the name Alec James Heidel contained a photo of Harvey Oswald, and this was the one and only item that directly linked Oswald to the rifle found on the 6th floor of the book depository. After I learned that Fritz knew about the two Alec James Heidel cards and the second wallet, I began to wonder about his connection and the extent of his collusion with Westbrook. The first person and the last person to be seen with the second wallet at 10th and Patton, the person who told Fritz that Oswald had a room on Beckley, and the person who brought the second wallet to the police station. I knew that Westbrook and Croy were involved with Tippett's murder and involved with the second wallet. I was now just very suspicious of Captain Fritz and his interactions with Westbrook and Croy. Now, I've put a note below, and this is very important. Secret Service agent Thomas Kelly took notes of Oswald's interrogation on Saturday morning, and he recorded Oswald refused to discuss the ID cards with Captain Fritz or with FBI agent Bookout. Captain Fritz also took notes of Oswald's interrogation. Now, sometime, we don't know when, we don't know where, Fritz wrote, quote, "Oh, Oswald. O told Owens the Alec James Heidel card belonged to him." That's what Fritz wrote in his notes. But that's not what Kelly, Secret Service agent Kelly, wrote in his notes. And it was not remembered by Agent Bookout, FBI agent Bookout. It appeared to me that this handwritten note was an attempt by Fritz, or maybe persons unknown after Fritz died, to link Harvey Oswald to the rifle found in the book depository. Now, here's the kicker. Fritz's notes, handwritten notes, allegedly by Fritz, first appeared 34 years after the assassination in 1997, when they were given anonymously to the Assassination Records Review Board. So, is there a reason to question Fritz's notes? You bet there is. By Saturday morning, Captain Fritz was well aware of the second wallet and knew this throwdown wallet would be used to frame Harvey Oswald for the Tippit murder. I believe that Fritz knew, or at least should have known, this was a throwdown wallet was a good indication that Oswald was never at the Tippit murder scene and he never shot Tippit. For years and years, I wondered why Oswald was arrested for killing Tippit. But I could never understand why Fritz never asked Oswald simple and very basic questions about the Tippit murder. I mean, this is a guy who was charged with murdering Tippit. But Fritz did not ask Oswald to describe the streets he took when walking from his rooming house to 10th and Patton. Fritz never asked Oswald whether he was walking east or west on 10th Street when he first saw the police car. Fritz did not ask Oswald if he knew Tippit or why a police officer called him over to the patrol car. Fritz never asked Oswald what he and the police officer talked about through the open passenger window. Fritz did not ask Oswald why he shot Tippit. Fritz never asked Oswald to describe the gun he used to murder Tippit. Fritz did not ask Oswald to describe the jacket he was wearing when he left the rooming house. Fritz did not ask Oswald what happened to the jacket. He didn't ask Oswald to describe the route, the streets he took when he walked to the Texas Theater. He didn't even ask Oswald if he bought a ticket to enter the Texas Theater. Oswald was never shown the jacket that was found planted by Captain Westbrook in the parking lot behind the Texaco station on Jefferson Boulevard. Fritz dared not ask Oswald any questions about the Tippit murder because Harvey Oswald was never at the Tippit murder scene. And his answers to any questions about the Tippit murder would be noted by FBI and Secret Service agents sitting in the interrogation room. Now, for the first time, I understand Captain Fritz's reason for not interrogating Oswald or any suspect with a tape recorder or a stenographer in the room. Fritz could pick and choose the questions he wanted to ask a suspect and then write a few notes that supposedly recorded a suspect's answers to questions. These notes, however, could never be verified, but they would likely never be challenged or questioned. A second Oswald wallet from the Tippit murder scene in police headquarters was a very serious problem. If the press and public learned about a second wallet, they would quickly suspect it was a throwdown wallet that conveniently appeared out of nowhere at the Tippit murder scene for the purpose of framing Oswald as the man who murdered Tippit. When the public and or the press began to realize that Oswald was being framed for the Tippit murder, they would probably wonder if Oswald was also being framed for President Kennedy's murder. Fritz, Westbrook, and possibly other high-ranking police personnel understood this second wallet was a very serious problem and had to be hidden from the public. They had to cover up the second wallet. They had to hide Westbrook's involvement, hide Fritz's knowledge of the second wallet and the ID cards, and blame Oswald for Tippit's murder. The second wallet was not turned over to the Identification Bureau. No report was written, no inventory report, no photographs were taken of the second wallet. But the second wallet was known to many Dallas police officers at the Tippit murder scene, including Captain Westbrook, Captain Doty, Sergeant Owen, Sergeant Croy, Captain Fritz, and all of the police officers who were standing around when Westbrook was asking Agent Bob Barrett, hey, do you know Alex James Hydell? You know Lee Harvey Oswald? Quite a few police officers probably heard Westbrook. After all, Westbrook was in charge of personnel. He probably hired most of the people at Tenson Patton. When these people who knew about the wallet were interviewed by the FBI, the Secret Service, the Warren Commission, the House Select Committee, or the press, not one of them said anything about a second wallet found at the Tippit murder scene. This is extremely important. Cover-up of the second wallet meant that every police officer who saw or handled or heard about the second wallet had to be warned by senior Dallas police officers not to say anything about the wallet. 33 years later, in 1996, the public finally became aware of the second wallet when the book Assignment Oswald was written and released by retired FBI agent James Hosty. When people learned about the second wallet, who did they want to talk to? Westbrook. But Westbrook, the man who knew the secrets of the second wallet, conveniently died 3 weeks before Hosty's book was released. Now, if you just think about what could have happened if the public knew about a second Oswald wallet at the Tippit murder scene, think what they would have said. Think what they would have thought. Oswald's being set up for murdering Tippit? I mean, You can't have the press think like that. You can't have the public know about that because they're automatically going to think, well, if he's set up for killing Tippit, maybe set up for killing Kennedy. The second wallet is the closest thing we have to what people call a smoking gun. Hiding the second wallet from the public and from the Warren Commission changed the course of history because it kept us from learning that Harvey Oswald had been framed for the Tippit murder and framed for the murder of President Kennedy. At 1:30 on Saturday p.m., Jack Ruby drove to the All-Right parking garage across the street from the Annex building, parked his 1960 Oldsmobile. He used the phone in the office and later asked to use the telephone at 2 o'clock. Ruby phoned KLIF hotline, known only to radio station personnel, and asked if any KLIF newsmen were at City Hall. After completing the call, Ruby left and within a few minutes called Thomas Brown, the manager of the parking garage. He told Brown that two men would soon stop by the garage and ask for him. Ruby asked Brown to tell the men to contact him at KLIF radio. The two unidentified men soon arrived and Brown relayed the message, but the identity of these men remains unknown. Around 3 o'clock, Ruby returned to the parking garage and again telephoned KLIF radio. Spoke with Garnet Hallmark, and he said, quote, "I understand they're moving Oswald over to the county jail. You know I'll be there," end quote. At 4 p.m., a WBAP news crew was outside of the police station waiting for the transfer of Oswald to the county jail. Ruby approached a WBAP engineer and cameraman and said that he knew Henry Wade, district attorney, and offered to get information for them. Ruby was apparently trying to pose as a news reporter to once again gain access to the police station and get close to Oswald when he was being transferred to the county jail. Later, Dallas police officer Billy Grammer said the day after the assassination, which was Saturday, he and his friend Jack Ruby had coffee and they talked for about an hour. Dallas Police Chief Jesse Curry discussed Oswald's transfer with the Warren Commission. Curry said, quote, "Fritz and I discussed the possibility of getting that prisoner out of the city hall during the night hours and by another route and slipping him to the jail. But Fritz was not too much in favor of this, and I more or less left this up to Fritz as to when and how this transfer would be made," end quote. Curry then asked Fritz, "What time do you think you'll be ready tomorrow?" Fritz said he didn't know exactly when he would transfer Oswald. Curry then said, quote, "Do you think about 10 o'clock?" End quote. Fritz replied, "I believe so." When reporters asked Curry when Oswald would be transferred to the county jail, he told the newspaper people and the news media they're not going to transfer Oswald that night, Saturday night. A reporter then asked, "When should we be back? When are you going to transfer him? When should we come back?" Curry replied, quote, "I believe if you are back here by 10 o'clock Sunday morning, you will be in time to observe anything you care to observe," end quote. After Ruby learned that Oswald would be transferred to the county jail the next morning, Sunday, he left the area and drove to his apartment. Ruby's roommate, George Senator, told the Warren Commission that when he arrived at Ruby's apartment at 10:30, Ruby was there, but Ruby left 5 minutes later. At 2:15 a.m. Sunday morning, just after midnight, Deputy McCoy of the Dallas County Sheriff's Office received a call from a man who said that his group was going to kill Oswald during the transfer to the county jail. 15 minutes later, 2:30, an unknown individual telephoned the Dallas FBI office, spoke with Special Agent Vernon Glossop and said, quote, "We're going to kill the man who killed the president," end quote. At 3:00 a.m., Dallas police officer Billy Grammer received a phone call from a familiar voice warning him that Oswald would be killed if the police didn't transfer him in secret. Grammer said the man detailed the plans to transfer, such as a decoy vehicle, information that could be obtained only with the help of police officers or other government agents. Grammer then asked a high-ranking police officer to listen in on the call. After the call ended, Grammer and his supervisor prepared a sworn affidavit regarding the man who called the police station and made threats against Oswald at 3:00. Grammer was never asked to testify before the Warren Commission, and the sworn affidavit that he and his supervisor personally gave to Chief Jesse Curry disappeared. After placing these early morning phone calls to the sheriff's office, FBI office, and Dallas police, Ruby likely drove home, arriving around 4:00 in the morning. At 8:00, 4 hours later, WBAP crewman Warren Ritchie was on top of the TV truck with his camera, and he noticed a man who he later identified as Jack Ruby standing in front of the police building. At 9:30 a.m., Ray Rushing, a preacher from Plano, Texas, had a brief conversation with Jack Ruby as the two men were riding in an elevator at City Hall. Warren Ritchie saw the same man, Ruby, again at 10:00. John Smith was inside the TV truck and saw the same man, Ruby, at 8 a.m. and again at 10 a.m. At 10:30, Ruby approached WBAP crewman Ira Walker and asked, quote, "Has he been brought down yet?" End quote. The testimony and statements given by Ritchie, Walker, Smith, and Rushing placed Ruby at City Hall between 8 a.m. and 10:30 a.m. Now, if Ruby was seen by 4 people at City Hall between 8 and 10:30, then how could Ruby have been in his apartment on Ewing Street in Oak Cliff across the Trinity River from downtown Dallas? Because at 10:19 a.m., one of Ruby's dancers, Karen Carlin, called Ruby at his home. A long-distance phone call was, in fact, recorded on Bruce Carlin's monthly phone bill at 10:19 a.m. from Fort Worth to Jack Ruby's phone in Dallas. But who answered the phone at Ruby's apartment? Ruby had been sharing his apartment with 50-year-old George Senator since early November. Eleonora Pitts had been cleaning Ruby's apartment every Sunday for several weeks prior to the assassination. Every Sunday, Eleonora would call Ruby to make sure that he wanted her to clean that day. Sometime after 8 o'clock on November 24th, Sunday, she called Ruby and a male voice answered the phone. Mrs. Pitts told the Warren Commission, quote, "He sounded so strange to me," end quote. She asked the man, quote, "Who am I talking to? Is this Mr. Jack Ruby?" The man answered, "Yes. Why? What do you want?" Mrs. Pitts replied, "This is Eleonora." The man said, "Yes, well, what? Do you need money? What do you want?" Mrs. Pitts said, "No." I was coming to clean today. The man said, coming to clean? Mrs. Pitts replied, this is Elnora. The man said, again, what do you want? Do you want me to come today? Yes, you can come, but you call me. Mrs. Pitts said, that's what I'm doing now. Mrs. Pitts, she was scared by the way he talked. The man did not sound like Ruby. He did not recognize Mrs. Pitts, and he knew nothing about her weekly cleaning of Ruby's apartment. Mrs. Pitts said, quote, he didn't talk like, he never did sound like himself, end quote. The only other person known to be in Ruby's apartment that Sunday was George Senator, Ruby's roommate. It is likely that Mrs. Pitts talked with George Senator at 8 o'clock, because at 8 o'clock, Ruby was seen by cameraman Warren Ritchie at City Hall. The question of whether or not Carolyn Carlin talked with Ruby on Sunday morning and asked him to send her $25 is very important, because Jack Ruby's reason, his alibi for being at Western Union at 11:15, minutes before he shot Oswald, was to send $25 to Karen in Fort Worth. If Ruby did not talk with Karen on Sunday morning, then he had no valid reason for being close to City Hall, a half a block from the Western Union office. Without a good reason, without an alibi for being close to City Hall, then Ruby would likely be convicted of a premeditated and pre-planned murder. The people who planned Oswald's murder wanted to make it appear as though Ruby spontaneously shot and killed Oswald. Basement level 1 at City Hall on the west side of the ramp contained the jail office and the jail elevator from the 3rd floor, police headquarters. Basement level 1, same level, of the annex building on the east side of the ramp was the police parking area. The underground auto ramp, which divided the two buildings, ran from Main Street on the north to Commerce Street on the south. Midway through the ramp, there was a smaller ramp that ran slightly downward for a short distance to the L-shaped parking garage, the basement of the annex building, where there was room for 40 cars to park police cars. In addition to the two ramp entrances, Main Street and Commerce, there were 5 doors that provided access to the parking area from City Hall and the annex building. 3 of these doors open into elevators, 2 passenger elevators, 1 freight elevator, near the central part of the parking area. A 4th door at Commerce Street side of the garage opened into the sub-basement. A 5th door, and this is the door that's critical, near the 3 elevators, opened into a stairway that led to the 1st floor of the annex building. All this is explained in a drawing on the website. When Chief Police Curry arrived at police headquarters on Sunday morning about 8 o'clock, he was told about the threatening call made against Oswald. The threatening phone call was answered at police headquarters by Officer Billy Grammer, who thought he recognized the caller as his friend, Jack Ruby. Grammer asked a high-ranking supervisor to listen in on the call. Grammer then prepared the typewritten report, which he and his supervisor gave personally to Chief Curry. Grammer said that Chief Curry looked at this report for about 10 seconds and then commented, quote, "There's nothing to that. and he put it down. Now, there's a very nice interview of Billy Graham on YouTube, and you can click this. If you don't look at the website, you can simply type in Billy Graham, Longview, Texas, Ruby, Jack Ruby, and you'll find the interview. It's about 7 or 8 minutes long. Now, there's no evidence that Curry wrote a memo or notified a single police officer of Jack Ruby's threat against Oswald. The typewritten report that Graham gave to Curry, witnessed by a high-ranking supervisor, disappeared. Curry, during his Warren Commission testimony, never mentioned Billy Graham or discussed the typewritten report given to him by Graham. Curry apparently took this threat seriously because he has suggested to Assistant Chief Police Charles Batchelor and Deputy Chief Stevenson that Oswald would be transported to the county jail in an armored truck. And both men agreed. Now we're getting close, about an hour away from Oswald's appearing in the basement. At 10:20, Curry told a press conference that Oswald would be transferred to the county jail in an armored truck. Chief Curry learned that the truck had arrived, and he informed Captain Fritz that security controls were in effect and how long the questioning of Oswald would continue. At this point, Fritz learned for the first time of the plan to convey Oswald by armored truck and immediately expressed his disapproval. He urged the use of an unmarked police car driven by a police officer, pointing out that this would be far better from the standpoint of both speed and maneuverability. Curry agreed to Fritz's plan. The armored truck would be used as a decoy. After learning about threats against Oswald, 2 members of the Dallas police suggested to Fritz that Oswald be taken from the building to another exit, avoiding the press, and arrive at the county jail before anyone knew Oswald had left the building. Secret Service agent Forrest Sorrells suggested to Fritz that Oswald be moved at an unannounced time when nobody was around. County Sheriff Bill Decker wanted to transfer Oswald at night. But Captain Fritz was not interested in quietly removing Oswald from City Hall, transferring Oswald late at night, allowing the sheriff's office to move Oswald, moving Oswald in an armored truck, or moving Oswald at any time unknown to the press. Fritz was focused on transferring the most important prisoner in the history of Dallas on a Sunday morning in front of news reporters, cameras, and dozens of police officers. Sunday was a good day to transfer Oswald because government employees from both City Hall and the Annex building were absent. Both buildings were essentially vacant, except for news reporters and police on the 3rd floor of City Hall, police headquarters, and in the basement. Now, Captain Talbert was in charge of security for Oswald's transfer to the county jail. Talbert ordered policemen from several districts to report to the basement and gave orders to remove and exclude all unauthorized persons from the basement area. Deputy Chief Stevenson instructed all detectives within the building to remain for the transfer. Shortly after 9 o'clock, the police cleared the basement except for police personnel. Officers Jess and Taylor were stationed at the top of the Commerce Street ramp to keep all spectators on the opposite side of Commerce Street. Officer Vaughn was stationed at the top of the Main Street ramp. Talbert then ordered Sergeant Patrick Dean, along with 14 patrolmen, to search the garage, and maintenance workers were told to leave the area. Policemen searched the rafters, the tops of air conditioning ducts, closets, and the interior and trunk compartment of all automobiles parked in the garage. After the search was completed, the police allowed verified news representatives to re-enter the basement and gather along the entrance to the garage on the east side of the ramp. Later, the police permitted the newsmen to stand in front of the railing on the east side of the ramp leading to Main Street. The policemen had instructions to allow no one but identified news media representatives into the basement. Many newsmen reported that they were checked on more than one occasion while they waited in the basement. Chief Curry issued instructions to keep reporters and cameramen out of the jail office and to keep television equipment behind the railing that separated the basement ramp from the parking area. All this you can see in the drawing below. Reserve officers were stationed at various locations in and around the building and the parking area. Police officers were also assigned to all street intersections along the route to the county jail. There were 5 doorways into the parking garage area and a set of double doors leading to the public hallway adjacent to the jail office. A door on the Main Street side of the parking led to the sub-basement. 2 doors passenger elevator. We've talked about this before, but I've got a drawing that shows all this. The 2 elevators were not in service, and the doors for these 2 elevators were shut and locked. Another door opened into the service elevator, which was moved to the first floor, and the operator was instructed not to return the elevator to the basement. Another door near the passenger elevators opened onto a stairway that led to the first floor of the annex building. Officer Alvin Brock was assigned to guard this door and the nearby elevators, with Reserve Officer G.E. Worley standing nearby. This is about a half an hour before Oswald was shot. At 10:45, Officer Brock, who personally knew Jack Ruby, was told to leave the building and was reassigned to traffic detail at Elm and Irving. Brock assumed that a reservist located in the immediate vicinity, Officer G.E. Worley, would guard this area. But a few minutes after Brock left, Worley was also assigned to traffic duty and left the building. 15 to 20 minutes before Oswald was brought to the basement, there were no police officers guarding the parking area. Before Oswald was brought down to the basement, an unidentified reserve officer took Brock's place and stood guard near the elevators and the door to the stairway. I believe this unidentified reserve officer was Sergeant Kenneth Croy. And the reason I believe it was Croy is because less than 2 minutes later, Croy was standing shoulder to shoulder with Jack Ruby when Ruby lunged forward and shot Oswald. "11 o'clock a.m., Deputy Chief Stevenson requested Captain Jones of the Forgery Bureau to bring all available detectives to the basement. Jones instructed the detectives who accompanied him to the basement to line on walls on either side of the hallway that led to the ramp in preparation for Oswald's transfer. 2 police officers stood in front of the double doors that led into the hallway. Along the south wall of the hallway for 8 detectives, with 3 detectives standing along the north wall. As the police escorted Oswald through the hallway toward the police car, they were walking between 2 lines of police detectives. Before Oswald appeared in the basement, 40 to 50 newsmen and 70 to 75 police officers were present. We have a schematic that shows the location of every one of those people. They are identified by number in the drawing, and separately there is a list identifying which number was which officer or which newspaper reporter by name. A group of newsmen and police officers, about 20, stood across the bottom of the Main Street ramp. More than 100 news reporters and police were in the basement where Oswald was shot, but not one person reported seeing Ruby walk down the ramp from the Main Street entrance. At 11:07, the armored truck that was parked at the Commerce Street side of the ramp. When the press learned of its arrival, many of the newsmen who had been waiting on the 3rd floor hurried to the basement. Chief Curry, for the first time, told Fritz that Oswald was to be transferred in an armored truck. Fritz once again disagreed and expressed his disapproval, citing concerns that the driver of the armored truck was not a police officer and the large truck was not very maneuverable. With the armored truck already on site, Curry then decided to use the armored truck as a decoy. Now, nobody saw Ruby walk on the Main Street ramp or enter the ramp. Main Street is a street that goes directly from Western Union to the Main Street ramp. And nobody saw Jack Ruby walking on Main Street, and nobody saw him walk down the ramp. Sergeant Putnam assigned Roy Vaughn to guard the Main Street ramp and obtain identification from anyone who wanted to use the ramp for entry into the basement. Vaughn began his assignment at 9:30 and stood 2 to 3 feet inside this very narrow ramp. The ramp was about 12 feet wide. Vaughn had known Ruby since 1959 and insisted Ruby did not go down the Main Street ramp. At 11:18, and this is where we get into Oswald's time. At 11:18, as Ruby was leaving the Western Union office, Lieutenant Real Pierce, accompanied by Sergeant James Putnam and Billy Joe Maxey, drove an unmarked police car up the ramp and onto Main Street. All of these officers knew Jack Ruby, and all said that nobody, including Ruby, came down the ramp as the car was moving up the ramp and onto Main Street. Sergeant Don Flush was the, quote, watch commander and was parked across the street from the Main Street ramp when he watched the unmarked police car drive onto Main Street at 11:18. Flushy knew Jack Ruby for years and said Ruby did not walk down Main Street, was not anywhere near the ramp, and did not go down the ramp. Harry Tasker, a cab driver, was hired by a reporter to wait outside the police building, outside the Main Street ramp from 9:40 a.m. to 12:25 p.m. to be available to carry film of Oswald's transfer. Tasker parked his cab across the street from the Main Street ramp and stood at the entrance to the basement 5 minutes before Oswald was shot. Tasker saw the police car drive up, leave the building, but did not see anyone go down the ramp. UPI reporter Terrence McGarry was standing on the northern portion of the ramp 5 minutes before Oswald was shot. McGarry did not see anyone resembling Ruby go down the ramp. Detective W.J. Harrison watched the car driven up the ramp and saw nobody come down the ramp. So, pretty clear that Ruby did not go down the Main Street ramp. We now know that Ruby tried to enter Captain Fritz's office on the third floor of City Hall. How did Ruby know the location of Fritz's office on the third floor? How did Ruby know Oswald was in Fritz's office when he tried to enter? Ruby was at Henry Wade's press conference on Friday evening and insisted on standing on a table with a gun in his pocket. How did Ruby know about a late night press conference? Early Saturday morning and late Saturday evening, Ruby was at City Hall waiting for Oswald to be transferred. Again, how did Ruby know that Oswald was going to be transferred on Saturday? Ruby was looking for an opportunity to shoot Oswald and eliminating him from the moment Oswald was brought to police headquarters. Oswald had to be silenced because if there were ever a trial, then Oswald's connections with FBI, CIA, his so-called defection to the Soviet Union, his presence in the United States in 1957 and 58 when Lee Oswald was in Japan, all of this stuff, his entire family history, his background, and his dual identity would be exposed. There was, however, as we've talked about before, a slight problem. The conspirators needed to have Oswald killed with the press watching and the cameras rolling. Oswald could not be killed in police custody behind closed doors because the public would believe that Oswald was murdered in order to silence him. Sunday morning, with only the police, press, and cameras allowed in the basement of City Hall, was the perfect time and place for the public to see an enraged nightclub owner murder the man who killed President Kennedy. Ruby's constant presence at City Hall on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday morning clearly show that his arrival in the basement of City Hall only 1 or 2 minutes before Oswald arrived was not a combination of luck and coincidence, as reported by the Warren Commission. Ruby was looking for an opportunity to kill Oswald. But was he acting on his own, or was he following orders? Ruby answered this question on multiple occasions. Number one, early morning hours on Sunday, 8 hours before he murdered Oswald, Ruby called the sheriff's office, the FBI, and the Dallas police to warn them that Oswald would be killed if the police didn't transfer him in secret. Ruby was not passionate about killing Oswald. He was following orders. The purpose of Ruby's phone call was to provide the police with a reason to quietly and secretly transfer Oswald to the county jail, thereby making it impossible for Ruby to complete his assignment to kill Oswald during the transfer. Number 2, Ruby himself said, quote, "Who else could have timed it so perfectly by seconds? If it were timed that way, then someone in the police department is guilty of giving me information as to when Oswald was coming down." End quote. What Ruby said was very clear. If he killed Oswald on purpose, some police officers knew when to bring Oswald down. Number 3, Ruby told Chief Justice Earl Warren, "Gentlemen, my life is in danger here. Not with my guilty plea of execution. I tell you, gentlemen, my whole family is in jeopardy. My sisters as to their lives." End quote. Number 4, on June 7th, 1964, Ruby told Chief Justice Earl Warren, quote, "I have been used for a purpose." End quote. Number 5, a year after his conviction in March 1965, Ruby conducted a brief televised news conference in which he stated, quote, "Everything pertaining to what's happening has never come to the surface. The world will never know the true facts of what occurred, my motives. The people who had so much to gain and had such an ulterior motive for putting me in the position I'm in will never let the true facts come above board to the world." A reporter asked, "Are these people in very high positions, Jack?" Ruby said, "Yes." Fritz was asked if he took notes during Oswald's interrogation. He first told the Warren Commission, "I kept no notes at the time." But later in his testimony, Fritz said that he kept only rough notes. Fritz was taking notes, as remembered by other people, the FBI and Secret Service, who were present during Oswald's interrogations. On one occasion, when Fritz asked Oswald a question that he had already answered, Oswald told Fritz, "Check your notes." Fritz could have questioned Oswald about many things, but the questions asked by Fritz and the answers provided by Oswald during 12 hours of interrogation are mostly unknown. Like I said before, I was now able to understand and agree with Henry Wade's observation of Fritz when he said that Fritz ran a kind of one-man operation and was reluctant to tell others what he was doing. Fritz did not ask Oswald why he boarded the Mercedes bus instead of the Beckley bus. He didn't ask Oswald anything about the Tippit murder. He didn't tell the Warren Commission the name of the man who told him Oswald lived in a rooming house on Beckley. He never said a word about the second Oswald wallet to anybody. He didn't let anyone tell him how to transfer Oswald. He didn't let anyone tell him when to transfer Oswald. Running a one-man operation meant that Fritz could pick and choose the questions he wanted to ask Oswald, and he could choose the information that he wanted to be made public. Maybe Fritz did receive information from Oswald that he dared not make public, but how are we to know? Fritz's notes, handwritten notes, were purportedly answers to questions given to Oswald during his interrogation sessions in 1963. Now, they may or may not be what Oswald said. They may or may not be accurate. We don't know. But these handwritten notes were first seen by the public 34 years later, anonymously given to the ARRB in 1997. Now, Captain Fritz's continued insistence that Oswald be transferred during the day in front of the press on a Sunday required dozens of police officers and detectives to work overtime on Sunday morning. But refusing to quietly transfer Oswald to the county jail and then telling the news media when, where, and how Oswald would be transferred gave the conspirators a very convenient opportunity to plan the murder and to silence Oswald. Now, they needed a motive for Ruby to kill Oswald. Ruby's motive was he wanted to spare Jackie Kennedy from having to testify at Oswald's trial. He needed an alibi to be at or near the city hall when Oswald was transferred. That's why you have a timestamp on the money transferred to Karen Carlin at Western Union. Number 3, avoiding the police by entering the basement from the annex building, unseen by Dallas police officers. Number 4, arriving in the basement only a minute and a half before Oswald arrived. Number 5, blending in with the news media. He was dressed in a suit and tie with a hat. Number 6, knowing exactly where to stand while waiting for Oswald to appear. And who does he stand by? Sergeant Croy. The most important part of the plan was how to get Ruby in the basement only a minute or two before Oswald was escorted from the 3rd floor to the basement. Look, the longer Ruby was in the basement waiting for Oswald, the more likely he would be recognized and ordered by police to leave. Getting Ruby into position in the basement required coordinating the movements of both Ruby and Oswald, so both men arrived in the basement at nearly the same time. This could only be accomplished with the cooperation of Captain Fritz, the one and only man who had total discretion as to when Oswald would be taken from his interrogation room, his office on the 3rd floor, and brought to the basement in City Hall. Without Fritz's cooperation, Ruby would have no idea when Oswald would be brought down to the basement. However, before taking Oswald from his office and down the elevator, Fritz had to be certain that Ruby was in place. This required either direct contact between Fritz and Ruby or contact between Fritz and a 3rd person who was observing Ruby's every move. This 3rd person had to be a police officer who was well known, trusted by Fritz, and had complete access to police offices on the 3rd floor. This 3rd person, in my opinion, was Captain Westbrook. It is worth remembering that on Saturday evening, Chief Curry told the press that if they wanted to witness the transfer of Oswald to the county jail, they should return to City Hall at 10 o'clock Sunday morning. But at 10 o'clock on Sunday morning, Oswald was still being questioned in Fritz's office because Ruby had not yet arrived at Western Union. Fritz had to continue questioning Oswald until he knew Ruby was in place in the basement of City Hall. Now, Fritz occupied an interior office located on the third floor of City Hall. There were no exterior outside windows from which to see Ruby at Western Union, see Ruby as walking towards City Hall. In fact, visual contact with the Western Union office, which was a half a block east of City Hall, was impossible from any window in the City Hall building. There were, however, windows in the northeast corner of the building on all floors that overlooked the all-right parking. So it could have seen Ruby when he parked his 1960 Oldsmobile. However, on the east side of the City Hall is the Annex building, the building constructed in 1956. And the east side of that building, on all three floors, is filled with windows that overlook the parking lot and the Western Union office. There's no indication that Captain Fritz received a phone call, placed a phone call, or had any communication with Ruby or anyone while Oswald was being interrogated. Yet somehow Fritz had to be alerted that Ruby was in the basement and it was time to move Oswald. A simple way to alert Fritz was through visual contact. The only person known to have entered Fritz's office during Oswald's last interrogation was Chief Curry. Curry told the Warren Commission, quote, "I went to Fritz's office and they were interrogating him. I stood around a few minutes, and when there was a lull in the interrogation, I asked Captain Fritz if he was about ready to transfer Oswald, and he said, well, no, they're still talking to him," end quote. So I left the room, and it was probably 10:30. The questioning of Oswald had to continue because at 10:30, Ruby had not yet arrived at Western Union. The press and news reporters filled the north end of the corridor on the third floor, waiting for Oswald to appear. In my opinion, the third person, Westbrook, left his office. Now, there's a good floor plan of the third floor on the website. I can describe it, but it's much easier if you just look at it. Captain Westbrook's office was on the south side of the third floor, away from the reporters. And just after Westbrook leaves his office, he walks through the corridor. There's a set of double doors. At the end of that little corridor, he turns left. I'll get into that in a minute. Now, here's what I think happened. Westbrook left his office on the third floor, and he walked through the corridor. No reporters. He went through the double doors, he turned left, and he walked east to the end of a small corridor, hallway, where there was a stairway. But this stairway was hidden by a door. Now, this location was described by Captain Fritz in his Warren Commission testimony. This hidden stairway led from the third floor of police headquarters to the second floor of City Hall, where a small hallway opened into the adjacent annex building. On Sunday, except for police on the third floor of City Hall, there were no city employees in City Hall or the annex building. Westbrook could walk to the east side of the annex building unseen, where there were dozens of windows that overlooked the parking lot and the building where Western Union was located. Westbrook could look out any of those windows and see Ruby as he entered and then left Western Union. We don't know how long Westbrook stood at the window waiting for Ruby to arrive, but it had to be well before 11 o'clock because they didn't know where Ruby was. They didn't know when he would appear. The best observation point from which to watch Ruby as he walked across Main Street and entered the Western Union office were the windows on either the second or third floor of the annex building. I believe that Westbrook likely looked through one of these windows that was located directly above the entry door from the parking lot into the annex building. It was essential for Westbrook to remain on the second floor of the annex building, look out a second floor window, and wait for Ruby to arrive, because he didn't know when Ruby was going to arrive. About 11:10, Ruby parked his car at the All Right parking lot, walked across Main Street, and entered the Western Union office. A few minutes later, at 11:17, Ruby sent a money order for $25 to Karen Carlin in Fort Worth. Westbrook watched Ruby as he arrived and then left Western Union a minute or two later and began walking from Western Union through the parking lot. Ruby entered the annex building and he walked about 40 feet to a fire escape stairway that led to the police parking area in the basement, which was very dark and dimly lit and guarded by one person. Walking from Western Union to the basement in City Hall took 2.5 minutes. In the police parking area, there was now only one unidentified reserve officer standing guard, who I believe was Sergeant Croy. Why do we think it was Croy? Because 1 minute later, Croy and Ruby were filmed as they stood side by side waiting for Oswald to appear. Now, in 1963, I was able to identify 2 entries from the annex building into City Hall. And these entries were described by Captain Fritz and Curry to the Warren Commission. One entry was for the public, and one entry was well hidden and used only by the police. In 1956, the annex building was constructed and joined with the City Hall building. Now, the second floor of the City Hall building has arched windows. The windows have a concrete arch over them. It's the only floor that has the arched windows. The southernmost arched window on the east side of the second floor of the City Hall building. When these buildings were joined, they used one of the windows as an entry between the two buildings. I've got a photograph of it and a schematic of the third floor on the website. Now, this might seem a little confusing. I'll discuss it later, but the photograph that I have is of the original window from the building that was built in 1914. And what has happened is the annex building, which was joined to the back side of the City Hall building, there was a wall and an opening and a hallway, a very short hallway that led from the annex building into City Hall. The problem was that the annex building and the City Hall building were renovated at a cost, believe it or not, of $71 million in the year 2016. And both of these access points were covered up. They're not there anymore. And I was able to find these drawings, these photographs, by looking through dozens and dozens of photographs that were taken during the restoration of these two buildings. Anyway, the southernmost arched window on the east side of the second floor of City Hall was made into an entry between the annex building and the City Hall. The center of the window, and I've drawn this so you can see it, the center of the window was enlarged and it was heightened to accommodate a small hallway. At the end of the small hallway was the stairs that led to the third floor of City Hall, the police headquarters. The third floor stairway is adjacent to the assistant police chief's offices, and it's hidden by a door at the end of the corridor. In other words, if you walked down the corridors on the third floor, you could not see the stairway. It was covered by a door. In 1963, there was one more access between City Hall and the Annex building, and this is on a landing between the first and second floors. I've got a photo, shows the door, and the two photos, which I've got on the website, both showing access between City Hall and the Annex building, were taken as both City Hall and the Annex building were being renovated in 2016. Now, I also have a photo of the newly remodeled first floor stairway and the landing where the door between City Hall and the Annex building used to be in 1963. During renovation, these 2 points of access between the City Hall and the Annex building were eliminated. They were covered up. The old City Hall building is now the University of North Texas College of Law School. The most likely way for Westbrook to return to police headquarters on the third floor was through this small hallway on the second floor of the Annex building. We believe that when Jack Ruby either arrived at Western Union or when he left Western Union, Westbrook used the small, hidden, and inconspicuous hallway and stairs to return to the third floor of City Hall. He then walked through the main corridor, which was crowded with news reporters, entered homicide and robbery, was guarded by two uniformed officers, and he went straight to Captain Fritz's office. Alerting Fritz that Ruby was now in place in the basement could have been as inconspicuous as Fritz simply watching Westbrook walk past his office, or Westbrook briefly opened the office door and made eye contact with Fritz. For what it's worth, there's a big glass pane in Fritz's door to his office and a much larger window in Fritz's office, covered with blinds, but if the blinds were open, all Fritz had to do was see Captain Westbrook, and he knows that Ruby's in place. As Fritz was ending Oswald's interrogation on the third floor, Ruby was already in the Annex building and walking to the stairway, the fire escape, from the first floor to the basement. That's at 1119. In the police parking area, both of the police officers who had been assigned to guard this area, Officer Brock and Officer Worley, had been reassigned to traffic duty a half an hour earlier. There were dozens of press people, news reporters, and TV cameras, but only one police officer was supposed to be guarding this area, an unidentified reserve officer, who I believe was Sergeant Croy. After walking down the stairs, Ruby opened the unlocked door. Now, think of this unlocked door like a door in a movie theater, a fire door. If there's a fire in a movie theater, you go to the door, you push the door open, and that's it. But from the outside, nobody can open this door. It can only be opened from the inside. That's a fire escape. As Ruby began walking through this dimly lit parking area to the lower section of the Main Street ramp, Sergeant Croy began walking up the incline to the Main Street ramp, and he stood on the ramp with reporters. Croy told the Warren Commission he had only been in this position for a few minutes before the shooting. Detective James Watson described the actions of the press moments before the shooting. Watson told the Warren Commission, quote, "They, the press, were all lined up against the railing in the parking area. The railing separates where the cars park from the ramp. But the moment this starts, they crawl through and come forward onto the Main Street ramp. The press was actually in the basement area and on the fence there on the guardrail. And then at the time they had already, so many of them had gotten over the rail and were just inside on the ramp area." That's what Detective Watson is describing. When Oswald was being brought out, they all went right through the railing, tried to get, cameras and microphones, ask questions of Oswald. The first person to see Jack Ruby on the Main Street ramp was 38-year-old Jimmy Turner, a TV director at WBAP TV in Fort Worth. Turner provided testimony that appears to provide the answer as to when Ruby was first seen on the Main Street ramp and how long Ruby was on the ramp before he lunged forward and shot Oswald. Ruby was probably walking slowly in order to avoid coming in contact or being seen and recognized by police. Now, here's Leon Hubert, Warren Commission Attorney Hubert, questioning Mr. Turner. "He was coming down the Main Street ramp at that time?" "That's right." "He was moving?" "He was moving at that time, but he seemed to be heavier than I see him now. I don't know whether it's an illusion because it was in a very dark place." Quote, "Did you see a man come out from the crowd and shoot Oswald?" "Yes, sir." "Was that the same man that you have described?" "It was the same man." Okay. Turner testified that while he was standing near the railing on the east side of the Main Street ramp, the lower parking area, he first saw a man he was confident that was Ruby. He pinpointed his location on a Warren Commission exhibit. In fact, it's Warren Commission exhibit 5080. Now, Turner's location, which he described as being next to the first column, concrete column, and 3 television cameras, was about 20 to 25 feet from where he first saw Ruby. Turner observed this man as he was walking slowly down the Main Street ramp about 10 feet from where the downward slope of the ramp ends. In other words, he didn't see him walk from the Main Street entrance. He only saw him when he was walking in the middle of the building on the flat part of the Main Street ramp. The 7 members of the Warren Commission showed no interest in investigating the possibility that Ruby entered the basement from another location other than down the Main Street ramp. Warren Commission attorneys Bert Griffin and Leon Hubert were assigned to look into Oswald's murder. They knew from the time Ruby received the timestamp on the money order, 11:17, until he shot Oswald, 11:21, was 4 minutes. They also knew that Jimmy Turner said that Ruby was standing on the ramp about 30 seconds before he shot Oswald. Therefore, Ruby had only about 3.5 minutes after he left Western Union to arrive at the bottom of the Main Street ramp. The FBI was asked to determine how long it would take to walk from Western Union to the railing in the basement of City Hall where Jimmy Turner said he first saw Ruby. On June 26, 1964, an FBI agent walked from Western Union across the parking lot, entered the annex building, walked down the stairs to the basement, climbed through the railing, and stepped onto the Main Street ramp. 2 minutes, 25 seconds. Now, I've got an image, a photograph, which was taken looking down the Main Street ramp. And I've identified where Turner was, where Ruby entered the Main Street ramp by crawling over the railing, where Croy was, and where Oswald was. Very easy to see. Now, the image above, which is the schematic showing how Ruby walked down the stairs and walked straight over to the railing and got onto the ramp. 11:17, his arrival at the Main Street ramp was at 11:19 and a half. That's 2 minutes and 25 seconds after the timestamp on the money order. And he shot Oswald a minute and a half later at 11:21. It appears that Ruby could only have been in the basement waiting to murder Oswald for 1 to 1.5 minutes. For Jack Ruby, he had to be on the bottom portion of the Main Street ramp where police detectives were waiting for Oswald to appear. The safest place for Ruby on the Main Street ramp was standing next to a friendly police officer. When Ruby heard a reporter shout, "Here he comes," Ruby joined a line of reporters and he stood directly next to Sergeant Croy. Croy was the second person to see Ruby on the Main Street ramp. Now, Croy and Ruby can be seen standing side by side in film clips of the shooting. Ruby is on the left shoulder of Croy. Warren Commission Attorney Burt Griffin was very suspicious of Croy because he was the one and only police officer who saw Ruby before the shooting, stood next to Ruby, but did not ask him for identification or order him to leave. Griffin deposed Croy on March 26, 1964, and he suggested to Croy several times that he might need an attorney. Croy lied when he described Ruby and his actions immediately before he shot Oswald, and Griffin knew he was lying. Croy told Griffin that Ruby, quote, "ran by me at a pretty good clip. He was gaining momentum," end quote. He rushed through a line of reporters like a fullback. Now, Croy saw film clips of the shooting, supposedly, and he told Griffin, quote, "The ones that I saw were the ones that I was trying to get the gun from Ruby," end quote. Griffin, however, had reviewed all of the film clips of Ruby and Croy. Griffin knew that Croy did not try to stop Ruby and did not try to grab Ruby's gun. The film clips showed that when Ruby lunged forward to shoot Oswald, Croy backed up immediately and he disappeared. Griffin knew Croy was lying and probably thought Croy was somehow involved with Oswald's murder. Croy was lying to deflect attention from him and make it appear as though he was doing his job and trying to stop Ruby from shooting Oswald. Unfortunately, Griffin was probably not aware that the unidentified reserve officer who took Brock and Worley's place near the elevator and the stairs was the same person who stood next to Ruby when he shot Oswald. Croy. Griffin was focused on the first and only person who said that Ruby gained access to the basement by walking down the Main Street ramp unattended, and that was Sergeant Patrick Dean. Now, Dean was in charge of security for Oswald's transfer, and he was the third person to see Ruby in the basement. Dean was standing near the armored truck at the top of the Commerce Street ramp. From this location, Dean could see down the Commerce Street ramp, and he could see the area below where the two police cars were waiting for Oswald, lots of people, TV cameras, and he probably saw only the lower, very lower portion of the parking area, which was where the cars were parked, the 40 police cars. Dimly lit. And this is 75 to 100 feet distant. It's important to remember, and I've got a schematic, from Dean's location, standing behind the armored car truck on the at the top of the Commerce Street ramp, he was only able to see the lower portion of the Main Street ramp. He could not see the incline or the upper portion or the entrance to the Main Street ramp. Now, Burt Griffin deposed Dean on March 24th. Mr. Dean, I heard someone say, "Here he comes, they're bringing him out." You could hear voices, excitement. Then I saw a man dart in. This was all the confusion before the shooting, but I do recall seeing a man dart out. I couldn't tell who he was. It was that fast. Witness snaps his fingers. Where did he seem to dart from? From the rail over there. The side dart out from a group of people that were standing against the railing. All right. Can you mark with an X and a circle around it where he was standing? Well, I don't recall how wide the curb is, but the railing, you can lean against the railing, standing on the ramp itself. How far would you say he was from the railing? I would say he was maybe up against the railing. Now, is that the man who shot Oswald? Yes, sir. There are no known witnesses who recall seeing Ruby or anyone walk from the stairway. This is the stairway in the annex building. This is the fire escape stairway to the railing in the dimly lit parking area. Dean first noticed Ruby when he darted in from the lower portion. It was only after this man shot Oswald and was subdued by the police officers that Dean learned he was Jack Ruby, a good friend of Dean's. Moments after Ruby shot Oswald, he was subdued by police. He said, "You all know me. I'm Jack Ruby." A few minutes later, Dean was interviewed by camera, by the press on camera. 5 to 10 minutes later, Dean was on the 3rd floor of City Hall and was told by Chief Curry to escort Secret Service agent Forrest Sorrells to the 5th floor to interview Jack Ruby. In his report to Chief Curry 2 days later, Dean said that Ruby, quote, "in the presence of Mr. Sorrells, that he had entered the basement through the ramp, entering on Main Street," end quote. Dean told the Warren Commission about their conversation. Ruby allegedly told Dean, quote, "I walked in the Main Street ramp. I have just been to Western Union to mail money order to Fort Worth. I walked from Western Union to the ramp. I walked in," end quote. However, Agent Sorrells the head of the Secret Service in Dallas, reported that Ruby said no such thing when he interviewed Ruby along with Dean. Detectives Clardy, Archer, and McMillan were also there with Dean when Ruby allegedly told Dean that he walked down the Main Street ramp, yet not one of these detectives said anything about the ramp in their initial reports concerning the murder of Oswald. After the conversation between Sorrells and Ruby ended, Dean said, quote, "When I got back to City Hall, I contacted Lieutenant Pierce and advised him. That's when I talked to Pierce about my conversation with Ruby. And I told him that I had talked to Ruby, and he told me how he'd gotten into the basement, which was breaking security, and that Officer R.E. Vaughn was the man involved. He, Pierce, notified the captain, Captain Talbot. 2 days later, Dean submitted a report to Chief Curry and identified Ruby's point of entry as the Main Street ramp, guarded by Roy Vaughn. Now, Dean could not change his story because of his written report to Curry. Tom Howard was the first attorney to advise and counsel Ruby after he was arrested. Howard said Ruby's hesitancy about discussing his entrance into the basement of City Hall was because he didn't want to get a police officer and friend in trouble. But Howard said nothing about how Ruby entered the basement. During Ruby's trial for murdering Oswald, he wrote a note to his attorney, Joseph Tonnehill, and said, "Joe, quote, you should know it was Tom Howard who told me to say I had come in via the ramp," end quote. If this is true, then Ruby did not tell Dean 5 minutes after he shot Oswald that he used the Main Street ramp to enter the basement. Ruby then suggested to his attorney that perhaps he should stop lying and tell the truth about how he really entered the basement. The simple fact is, the first and only person who said Ruby walked west on Main Street and entered the ramp was Sergeant Dean. He's the only one. Later that afternoon, Ruby refused to tell Captain Fritz how he got into the basement. On November 25th, Ruby refused to tell the FBI how he got into the basement. On December 1st and 3rd, he refused to tell the Dallas Police Lieutenant Revelle how he got into the basement. For the next 10 days, while Sergeant Dean was spreading the word that Ruby entered the basement via the Main Street ramp, Jack Ruby was sitting in jail and refused to tell anyone how he got into the basement. If Jack Ruby did not tell Dean that he came down the Main Street ramp, then Dean concocted this story. But why? One possibility is that when Dean first saw this man standing near the railing on the lower third of the Main Street ramp, he may have honestly assumed that Ruby had walked down the Main Street ramp. It's possible. A second possibility is that Dean may have made up the story to blame Roy Vaughn for letting Ruby into the basement, thereby keeping fellow police officers from blaming him for helping his good friend, Jack Ruby, enter the basement. A third possibility is that Dean knew that Ruby entered the basement from the stairway with help from other police officers. Either way, Sergeant Dean was likely not telling the truth, and Warren Commission attorney knew he was not telling the truth. After reading numerous reports of Ruby visiting headquarters on Friday, Saturday, Sunday morning, attorneys Bert Griffin and Leon Hubert were convinced that Ruby had been stalking Oswald. They knew that Ruby's presence at City Hall on Sunday morning was not coincidental, and they knew that Ruby somehow entered the basement for the purpose of killing Oswald. After months of deposing witnesses and examining evidence, Griffin and Hubert both believed that when Ruby left Western Union, he entered the first floor of the annex building through a door on the east side of the building, walked down the fire escape stairs, and then entered the basement parking area. When Griffin deposed Dean, he seemed so sure Dean was lying about Ruby telling him he entered the basement via the Main Street ramp. The overwhelming evidence was that Ruby did not enter and walk down the Main Street ramp. Griffin suspected that Ruby entered the basement area via the stairway adjacent to the elevators. He asked Dean for the names of the officers Dean had assigned to guard the parking area. Now this is interesting. Dean told Griffin, "I assigned Officer R.E. Vaughn to the entrance ramp, which is entering on Main Street. Officer Nelson to the doorway coming from the police and court building. Officer Patterson to the Commerce Street ramp, and I assigned one reserve officer to the southern portion of the basement, to the stairway that lead to the sub-basement or the machine room." Griffin was waiting for Dean to identify the officer assigned to watch the elevators and the stairway, but Dean was silent. "Mr. Griffin, Bert Griffin, who checked the stairway door in the garage that leads into the municipal building?" "The stairway door?" "Yes." "Mr. Dean, I don't know of any door that leads up to the stairway." "Mr. Griffin, there's the stairway, over where the elevators are." "Mr. Dean, oh, yes." "Griffin, who checked that door?" "Well, Sergeant Putnam checked it once, and I checked it once, and it was locked." "Mr. Griffin, did you know at the time you checked it that even though the door was locked from the outside, it could be pushed open from the inside?" "Dean." No response. He's quiet. "Mr. Griffin, now, where did you station Brock?" "Dean, put him in a position that he could see this door and also see these three elevators." But at 10:45, Brock was removed and assigned to traffic detail. A few minutes later, Officer Warney was removed from his post near the incline that led to the ramp. Both men were assigned to traffic detail, and there was only one unidentified reserve officer in the basement parking area near the door to the stairway. But Dean did not provide any of this information to Griffin. Bert Griffin now had several reasons to doubt that Ruby told Dean he came down the ramp, because the overwhelming evidence was that Ruby did not enter and walk down the Main Street ramp. While questioning Dean on March 24th, Griffin abruptly stopped and told the stenographer to take a break. Griffin confronted Dean, said he didn't believe him, and asked him to reconsider his testimony. Griffin expressed his doubts about what he felt were untrue answers given by Dean and suggested Dean may need an attorney. Griffin wrote a memo to J.L. Rankin, the chief counsel, explaining, quote, I believe it likely Ruby came in by another entrance to a point where Dean could have stopped him, and that Dean is trying to conceal his dereliction of duty. On May 15th, both Griffin and Leon Hubert sent a memo to J. Lee Rankin with a list of areas that needed further investigation and a list of people they wanted to question. Sergeant Dean complained about Griffin to District Attorney Henry Wade, who then called President Lyndon Johnson at his ranch in Texas and told him about the Dean and Burt Griffin confrontation. Seth Cantor, journalist, acknowledged that President Johnson began to exert pressure on Earl Warren. Dallas Morning News reporter Earl Goltz interviewed Dean concerning his dispute with Burt Griffin. Dean said, quote, Henry Wade called President Johnson at his ranch and told him about the trouble I was having with Griffin. The next day, it was on the front page about Griffin loading his butt on the airplane and going back to Washington, end quote. Texas Attorney General Wagner Carr, the Attorney General of Texas, accompanied Dean to Washington, D.C. when he met and shared his complaints with Chief Justice Earl Warren about Griffin's behavior. Griffin was not allowed to confront Dean at this meeting. The Warren Commission soon recalled Griffin from Dallas, and the investigation of the Dallas police stopped. Griffin had this to say, quote, I always thought all along about the Dallas police that anything that would get them into trouble or embarrass them, they would lie to us about. No question about it, end quote. In March 1964, Jack Ruby was found guilty of the premeditated murder of Oswald, but his conviction was overturned by a Texas appellate court. The court found that Dean's testimony should not have been admitted during the trial. Roy Vaughn, the officer assigned to guard the Main Street ramp, talked with Lieutenant Pierce 3 hours after Ruby shot Oswald. Vaughn was told that Ruby allegedly told Dean that he entered the basement via the Main Street ramp. Vaughn, who had only 2 brief contacts with Ruby years earlier, insisted Ruby never came down the ramp. Vaughn began his assignment at 9:30, stood 2 or 3 feet inside the building, and in the center of this very narrow ramp. Then there was the cab driver, Harry Tasker, stood on Main Street entrance, 5 minutes before Oswald shot, didn't see anybody. Then you got the UPI reporter, Terrence McGarry. Nobody. All of these people didn't see anyone go down the ramp. So, Roy Vaughn realized, but he could not understand why Dean was trying to make it appear as though he failed to properly guard the Main Street ramp. Vaughn knew that Ruby did not come down the ramp. The Dallas police officials were glad to hear that Ruby came down the ramp and that no Dallas police officers helped Ruby enter the basement. Vaughn was fighting a losing battle, and with the majority of police officers believing that Ruby came down the ramp, Vaughn was hopelessly outnumbered. So Vaughn sought the assistance and counsel of a local attorney, James Neal. And Neal suggested that Vaughn begin legal proceedings to try and clear his name. Vaughn was told by Police Chief Byrd to make an appointment and visit with City Attorney Alex Bickley. During that brief meeting, Bickley asked Vaughn not to go to court because, quote, the truth might come out about how Ruby got into the basement, end quote. And the truth would likely show Ruby's involvement with Dallas police officers. On November 24th, Dallas police officer Billy Grammer was home watching television as his friend, Jack Ruby, shot and killed Oswald. Grammer never forgot the memo he gave to Chief Curry concerning the phone call he received threatening Oswald's life. When Chief Curry failed to take this threat seriously and quietly transfer Oswald to the county jail at night, gave Jack Ruby the opportunity to murder Oswald. Finally, years later, in 1978, the HSCA asked Dean to answer questions in the form of written interrogatories, but Dean declined. The HSCA, this is the House Select Committee, concluded that Ruby's shooting of Oswald was not a spontaneous act, in that it involved at least some premeditation. Similarly, the committee believed that it was less likely that Ruby entered the police basement without assistance. There is evidence that the Dallas Police Department withheld relevant information from the Warren Commission concerning Ruby's entry to the scene of the Oswald transfer. The HSCA concluded that because of Ruby's perfect timing, quote, it made it difficult to accept mere coincidence, and it is unlikely that Ruby entered the basement without some sort of assistance, end quote. The committee was troubled by the apparently unlocked doors along the stairway route and the removal of security guards from the area of the garage nearest the stairway before the shooting. The evidence indicated that Ruby did not come down the Main Street ramp, but likely gained access to the basement by coming from the parking lot through the entry door on the east side of the annex building and walking down the fire escape stairway to the basement. The House Select Committee found this method of entry was not investigated by the Dallas Police, FBI, or the Warren Commission. Ruby's subsequent actions and behavior were aimed simply at protecting those who provided him with help to kill Oswald.
Yeah, well, that's great insight into what happened there. I think people, when they go through it and either play this and have you read along with the article or read it and get to the things. But, just like Ruby said, how could this have been down to the second unless I was helped, So he's kind of giving you the tip that, of course, he was helped down there.
Lynn, I'll tell you something very briefly. And that is that I looked at this thing for a couple of months. And it was only after a couple of months that I got into the Patrick Dean was the last part of my write-up. That's the part that I needed to get into because I didn't understand really why Griffin was focused on Patrick Dean so much. And then I learned for the first time that I was not the first person to think that Ruby came from the Western Union through the back door of the annex building and down that stairway, the fire escape stairway. I wasn't the first. Burt Griffin, he had this figured out in 1964. And the House Select Committee agreed and basically said the same thing in 1978. And so, I mean, it's like, why haven't I heard of this before? I mean, I thought I read a lot about the JFK thing, and I just never, I guess, just never got into the Ruby thing. But I'm glad I did, because I'm very, very happy that I was not the first person to discover this. My hat is off to Burt Griffin and to Leon Hubert. They did the work. You know, they did this in 1964, which is, I think, remarkable. And then the fact that Lyndon Johnson put pressure on Earl Warren, and they stopped investigating the Dallas police. I mean, that's very interesting.
More footprints of the cover-up.
You got it.
All right, John, thank you so much for your time.